Today we're going to talk about 2 Corinthians, which is a extremely personal and very practical letter. Real quick, there were actually more than 2 letters written to this church. We have 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, but there's at least one other letter in between those two. So what's happened is in 1 Corinthians, Paul has heard about some issues, he's read about some problems, and so he writes to address those. The church receives that letter, and some people respond by starting a rebellion against him. They basically say, who is this guy to tell us what we can and cannot do? Why should we follow his leadership? So he writes a letter that he would self-describe as being pretty harsh. And so he writes to them harshly to say why they should listen to him and why they should respect his leadership. And people respond in 2 different ways. Most people go, you're right. We should be following your lead. We know you're writing out of a position of loving us, but others continue to rebel. So now when he writes 2 Corinthians, it's in response to that in-between letter. So let me explain how this letter breaks down. There's basically 3 big movements: chapters 1 through 7, chapters 8 and 9, and chapters 10 through 13. In chapters 1 through 7, Paul is going to deal with one of the primary accusations that has been leveraged against him. The people that are rebelling and not following his leadership have said, if this guy was a man after God's heart, if he was a godly guy, if he was someone worth following, then surely his life would be going well. But thing after thing after thing in his life goes wrong. So are we really sure we want to follow him? And so the accusation has to deal with, why is he suffering so much? And so in these chapters, he writes about suffering and shows us how it ties us to Jesus and it helps us to better understand the cross. And when we see suffering in this proper frame of mind, it becomes something that we don't run from, but we walk through knowing that God is using it to shape us to be more like his son, Jesus. Then in chapters 8 and 9, he shifts to talking about generosity. The church in Jerusalem, where the whole church began, started off where they were super generous. They were giving their money to people who had needs. They were selling stuff they had to have more money in the pot to help people who were hurting. And they were awesome. But over the course of time, famine hits, they run out of money, and now they need help. And so Paul takes a collection to send back to this church to help those who have helped so many in the past. And so he talks to this church in Corinth, who they have some money, and basically says, look, when you know the generosity of Christ, when you know who he was, that he was infinitely rich, but he left his treasure to come and rescue us, it changes our hearts to leave our treasure to help others. And so these are 2 of the most beautiful chapters, most powerful chapters in all of the Bible when it comes to what it looks like to be a generous person in light of the love of God. And finally, in chapters 10 through 13, he addresses those people who are continuing to rebel against him. He tells them that if he wanted to pull rank, he could. He knows more. He's experienced more, but that's not the way of Jesus. So instead of pulling rank, he shows them how the gospel changes the way we influence people, that there's power in weakness, that there's power in serving others, that there's power in loving each other. And so in this letter, like I said, it's not only extremely personal, but it's very practical. We see how the gospel heals broken relationships. We see how the gospel shapes our view of suffering. We see how the gospel leads to generosity, and we also see how the gospel reclaims what it means to lead and influence others. So as you dive into this letter, let the gospel have a shaping impact on your life.